Hi, I'm Josh, here to talk about two works of literary fiction by Irish author Sebastian Barry. We have Days Without End, which was published in 2016, and we have A Thousand Moons, which was published in 2020, and which is the sequel to Days Without End. So almost 10 years ago, I had read Days Without End, and at the time I was pretty blown away by the book, and I posted a video about it back in 2017, very early on in my YouTube channel's life. So this would have been, like I said, almost 9 years ago, and of the more than 100 videos I've created about books, this was the 12th one I ever did. And so because I had already posted that video, I wasn't intending to talk much at all about this book. However, when I went back and re-watched that video to prepare for talking about these two books together, I realized just what an absolutely terrible video it was, and I took the video down. And I guess it's probably good that I don't go back and rewatch a lot of my old videos, or I might not have very many videos left on my channel, but I just couldn't keep that video up on my channel. What's really astonishing to me is that I recognized at least one commenter in that video from almost 9 years ago who still follows and supports my work here. And I was like, wow, they were watching this terrible old video and they still stuck with me, and all these years later are still standing by my side, as it were, here with me on my YouTube channel. So that kind of blew me away too. So I will talk a little bit more about this book, but not too much. Mostly I wanted to talk about its sequel because it's one that I had not talked about yet on my channel. Now, as I've mentioned previously, I almost never reread books, mostly because there are so many books that I have never read that are on my TBR list, books that I really would like to read that realistically I'll never get to in my lifetime based on the slow rate at which I read books. However, I did decide to go back and reread Days Without End in preparation for reading the sequel, A Thousand Moons. And I'm so glad I did, because it just reminded me of what an extraordinary book Days Without End is. But before I get into talking about specifics, I want to talk about language. So Days Without End is a book about a trans person, what we would refer nowadays to somebody who is assigned male at birth, but who turns out is a trans woman. However, this book takes place during the 1800s, and obviously since that time, humanity has come a long way with both our understanding of humanity and biology and all that sort of stuff, as well as with our language, with the ways we describe such things. And so I'm going to use the language that was employed in the book in order to avoid confusion as I talk about the books, but out of respect for the people that are being discussed, I will just mention that if I was talking about modern day peoples in modern day language, instead of referring to our main character in Days Without End as he, him, as is described in the book, I would refer to that character as she, her, as a trans woman, like I mentioned. And instead of using her name Thomas, which is employed in the book, I would use her chosen name of Thomasina, which is the feminine form of her name that she adopted when she was in women's clothing and appearing as a woman. Similarly, the groups of people known as the Indians in the book I would refer to nowadays as indigenous peoples, and so forth. But like I said, to avoid confusion when talking about the books, I will employ the language that the author used, which is appropriate to the time period that is being followed in the story here. Over the course of these videos, I will be spoiling a little bit of these books, not the plot specifically, but more about the identity of the characters are what I'm going to spoil a little bit. But other than that, plot-wise, I'm only going to really go on a surface level and discuss the main events of the books. Now, to go through a very brief plot summary, I will say that Days Without End occurs over a period of approximately a dozen years, from roughly 1850-ish until about 1866, 1867, not long after the end of the American Civil War. And in the earliest part of that time frame, in the 1850s, our main character, Thomas, is a boy of probably 10 to 12 years old, and he is living in Ireland, and his family dies of starvation and disease during the potato famine, and he gets on a boat and comes over to America. He ends up meeting another orphan boy who is just a couple years older than him. They become fast friends, and the rest of the book well, pretty much the entire book really follows the two of them as they progress through the next dozen years or so. First of all, they start as young boys getting hired by a theater owner, and because they are prepubescent boys, the theater owner hires them to play females in his theater, to dress as girls, and to actually dance with the patrons of his theater back in this old west town here, where it's mostly men that are inhabiting the place. And it is at that point that our main character Thomas discovers his true identity as a trans woman. He discovers when he takes on that identity of a female, that is really where his true self lies. Now, ultimately, the boys reach puberty, outgrow this role where they're able to play girls in a convincing manner. And so they leave the theater and they all ultimately fall in with the American Army. At that point, they're involved with the Indian War, where basically the genocide of the First Nations peoples is taking place. They participate in that. Through that process, they end up adopting a young Indian girl. Once the American Civil War comes along, they end up staying with the Army and fighting on the side of the Union, and they go through the events of the war. Then when the war concludes, they need to figure out how to start, I guess, a true life as a family, with Thomas and his friend/lover John and their adopted Indian daughter. And so in the remainder of the book, they're essentially trying to scrape together a living as farmers in the tumultuous post-Civil War era. So that is the general events of Days Without End. Then when we get to the sequel, A Thousand Moons, we fast forward several years, probably 7 or 8 years in time, and now we're in roughly the mid-1870s, 1875-ish, and this story takes place over a course of a year or two. And whereas Days Without End was entirely narrated by Thomas, by that character, this one is narrated by the Indian girl that they adopted, who at the beginning of this book is around 16 years of age. She is going by the name Winona. She is living with Thomas and John, as well as a black lady who was formerly a slave and another gentleman who was in the army with Thomas and John. And at one point early in the book, Winona is plied with alcohol and raped. And because of the state she was in with the alcohol, she was unsure who the perpetrator of that crime was. A lot of the book, as we go through the events of the story, is Winona trying to figure out who exactly did this to her and what the circumstances of it were. And once again, we're following this family as they struggle in this post-war era where there continues to be so much turmoil in that part of the US where they're living. So it's a much more condensed time frame and feels like a much smaller, I want to say a little more personal story, but that doesn't really do Days Without End justice, because that is very much a personal story of the troubles and growth experienced by the characters in this book too. But one historical aspect that kind of struck me from reading both of these books is the idea that the end of the American Civil War was by no means the end of the problems for black folks and for other non-white people in the US. And in fact, if anything, the immediate aftermath of the war was even more dangerous for black folks than probably was the situation before the war happened. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the US never dealt with the traitors who rose up against the United States in an effort to hold on to their slaves. And because nothing was done to them after the war, basically it was almost as if, all right, war's over, you lost, back home you go, carry on as normal, except no slaves now. Well, what do you think is going to happen? As these books illustrate, the Confederate side didn't just roll over and say, all right, you win, I guess our slaves are free now. Yes, they were forced to free their slaves, but then they would go around and hunt black people to kill them, to lynch them, to punish them for being free human beings. And so we see now, instead of all this abuse of black folks being just openly part of society with the slavery and so forth, now this sort of thing had to be taken underground. And so we got the rise of groups like the KKK and other racist white nationalist organizations that still continue to this very day. And so we see these groups of former Confederates in the stories creating gangs of people that were forerunners to the KKK, who basically saw it as desirable to get revenge on the black folks and the white folks who supported them. So this violence towards black people just continued, and I would say continues to this very day. Because those issues were never resolved at the time, we still have those very much alive and well hatred and lingering effects to this day in 2026, which is just such a sad, horrible situation. When you don't stamp out the cockroaches, they have a habit of reappearing in numbers again. And so, it's easy from a surface level look at history to say the American Civil War was fought, the Union won, the slaves were freed, everything was good and happy now. No, that wasn't the case at all. It was really just one necessary step for the treatment of black people like humans that really was never followed up on until the civil rights movement, really, I guess, of the 60s, saw some, again, minor improvements for black folks and people of color. And so that was another step along the way, but still very far from reaching that true level of equality that we would like to think would be the case. The thing that struck me most was the writing, especially with Days Without End. I would say this is one of, if not the most beautifully written book I've ever read. And why this almost makes no sense, why this shouldn't be the case, is the fact that, like I said, this book is entirely narrated by the character Thomas. Basically, it's as if Thomas is in his older age and he's looking back over the course of his life, and in particular those roughly dozen pivotal years of his life, and he's reminiscing and retelling that story of his experiences. And Thomas is an uneducated fellow, and so the entire book is written in this very stylized old Western slang as spoken by an uneducated man, and yet especially the descriptions of nature in the book are just so astonishingly beautiful that they literally took my breath away. I would read a passage and I would get this tightness in my chest, and I'd have to stop and just absorb it and go back and reread it again. And I don't know if I've ever experienced that in a book before, where I was so really floored by the beauty of the writing. And I guess the flip side of that is that you have to suspend a certain amount of disbelief in the fact that this is like I said, an uneducated man who is mostly speaking in this kind of rough, not necessarily grammatically correct way of speaking, and yet he is coming up with the most eloquent, beautiful descriptions of nature and the world around him. So, that doesn't quite fit, but I can certainly forgive that aspect because of just how amazing it is to read the book. Now, the other reason that this doesn't make sense, that it's such a beautifully written book, is the events that it's describing are horrific. We are talking about just the worst kind of murderous racism. We're talking about characters, our main characters, Thomas and John, participating in minstrel shows dressed in blackface. We're talking about these characters, again, actively participating in the genocide of the indigenous peoples. And then we're talking about the American Civil War and all the hatred and horror that happened in the immediate aftermath of the war as well. And so the events of the book are just the worst things that humanity has to offer. Like I said, we get into the sequel, and now we're talking about the rape of a teenage girl and similar racism and similar violence. And so somehow we're discussing such things, and yet the book is filled with so much beauty that you wonder how the two things can coincide together. And that's where the brilliance of the author, Sebastian Barry, comes into play. And in fact, I saw one review on GoodReads from a user named Jolene who described it perfectly. She says, Sebastian Barry is not a writer. He is an alchemist who turns what is base and depressing and disastrous into gold that sparkles with exuberance, a sense of adventure and hope, and a vein of optimistic and wide-eyed wonder runs through the gold like silver. And I think that's really perfectly stated, because it's astonishing that the two things can coincide together. And perhaps in that way, the author is contrasting the incredible beauty of the natural world, the world around us, with the incredible ugliness of the things that humans do to each other in particular. Because I wasn't really intending on talking about this book much in this video, like I said, I didn't mark those passages that really took my breath away like I was mentioning. Unfortunately, I wish I had now, but we can see Liege's need straight off even as we move along the trail. Beautiful creek running like an endless frosted beard. Field upon field of worried-looking land. Tall blackened weeds and some festering crop half won. This yellowed land, and then the frightened-looking sky stretching away to heaven, and all on the horizon the stubs and spikes of unknown black trees, then hills heaping away into the distance, and stubborn forest, and even further maybe mountains with their Jewish caps of snow. But not enough hands to make good these fields, that's clear. Don't have the spruced up spank of work. Ain't an army order nor ship-shape neither. We come slow up to the house, and there's old Liege with his crown in blessed white and his smile cutting open his mouth above a long white speckled meg. No hat, and the hair a fume of smoke. Queer to see him in civilian garb, that's certain. I will just highlight one passage here that I thought was a great example of a metaphor. And if you watch my book reviews, you'll see me giving a lot of examples of really terrible similes and metaphors and that sort of thing in other books I've read. But Emily had stood at the barricade, and the knowledge that she would likely meet another dawn had broken on her like the dawn itself. So here, the dawn is being compared to the dawn. Wow, mind-blowing. Next one. Okay, here is the very worst one. I saved it to last for you. Ready for this one? The heat rode on her shoulders like a fat man. Here's one that I thought was really well done in the sequel, 1,000 Moons. In this scene, our main character, Winona, the 16 to 17-year-old girl, is traveling by herself through the woods on her way to a scene that she knows is going to be a scene of violence between various men and other people here. The book says, "All the birds of the wood were very glad of the summer. As the morning burgeoned and opened its hands, they went firing among the new leaves like the gentlest of bullets. Greens against greens, half-seen fires of feathers, a busyness and bluster that delighted me as I walked the mule along. All the while the bird-blue sky reached down to me through the branches. The soft light of the sun rested on the turns of metal and the polished leather, the mule's great ears like a crazy gun sight." And so we see this, again, beautiful description of nature, of the woods and the birds and the mule and so forth. But the way it's being described is we're getting this military viewpoint. We're seeing the birds being described as the gentlest of bullets. The colors of the birds are fires of feathers. The mule's great ears were like a crazy gun sight. And so as we are proceeding to this place of warfare and conflict, we are seeing the nature around her being described with this military-like comparison. And so it's just that kind of really clever, really subtle, and really beautiful writing that absolutely blew me away about both books, especially with Days Without End, though. Now, to take this to a more personal level, I really liked how the author gave some descriptions of pain and mental anguish. These are things that, as somebody who has lived with chronic physical and mental illnesses pretty much my entire life, I've been at death's door with physical illness, I've been at death's door with my mental illness, and so the way the author describes these things is so vivid and so personal that it really also took my breath away in that case. So again, reading from 1,000 Moons. In this case, Winona has been shot in the shoulder and she's trying to make her way back home on her mule. And it says, "Once out on the road, alone, with the light now giving up the ghost and the torn blankets of dark and half-dark falling everywhere, I started to feel that wound like all soldiers must after a few hours pass. The first rush of strength subsiding and the pain growing ever more violent and netherworld, until you wonder you never gave greater thanks every moment of your life that had passed without such a burden. It weighed me down with its strange sense of violation and awfulness. It was a disgusting thing, the mealy-mouthed cousin of courage. I had no sensations in me other than it. It hurried everything else away, claiming me as its own. Only the pain, only the pain. Then, when I got right to the middle of the pain, I couldn't even breathe there. My chest was full of gasps. The road waved from side to side like a great run of water in a deep culvert. The browns of night mixed eagerly with the new blacks coming down. Every star was a shooting star. The moon rolled about prodigiously. Then everything was total black, total pain. And I've been there, and what a accurate description that is. Later on, we also get a hint of Winona's general mental state, the sort of general anxiety and anguish that she lives with on a day-to-day basis. And again, it was so relatable because I've often wondered, how often in my own life have I actually ever been really truly happy? And it's hard to think of more than a handful of times when that was the case. And so again, Winona narrates about a particularly happy event here. This was a joyous day, even for those that didn't have joy inside them, a mortgaged joy that even mournful folk could borrow. That idea of a mortgaged joy. So even when you are in a happy situation, and it's almost like you're getting to borrow other people's joy to feel a sense of fleeting happiness. Again, I just relate so much to that. And what's interesting too is that the quote that's given right at the beginning of the book here, before the book starts, we have a quote from somebody called Seneca that says, "Sometimes even to live is an act of courage." And isn't that the truth? In terms of thematic exploration, I did mention this sort of contrast between the incredible beauty of the world and nature. We see incredible ugliness and violence of humans, but a large part, I think, of the thematic exploration of these books is with identity. So obviously we have the character of Thomas, who we would say nowadays is a trans woman, and so that important part of identity is a key development with the main character that we follow in Days Without End. Similarly, our Indian girl Winona in A Thousand Moons, we would probably describe nowadays as being two-spirit, in that she is comfortable putting on the clothing and guise of a man, cutting her hair short, wearing men's clothes, passing as a man, and in fact has romantic feelings for a woman. And so nowadays she might, because of her heritage, describe herself as two-spirit. So again, that's part of identity too. But sticking with Winona here, we have a character, the main character of this book, the one who's narrating the story, who at an early age, probably less than 10 years old, who was a member of the Lakota tribe, had her entire family wiped out by the main characters of Days Without End, the American army here, who were participating in the Indian genocide. And so Winona's family was caught up with that, so she lost her entire identity in the process. So she lost her family. Her mother especially was an extremely important person in her life before she lost her mother. She lost the wider community of her people, the Lakota people, who were savagely murdered. Even her very name was taken from her. So Winona's actual name is Ojinjintka, but when she was adopted by Thomas and John, Thomas couldn't pronounce her real name, and so he renamed her Winona. And in fact, the very first words of the novel are this: "I am Winona. In early times, I was Ojinjintka, which means rose. Thomas McNulty tried very hard to say this name, but he failed, and so he gave me my dead cousin's name because it was easier in his mouth. Winona means firstborn. I was not firstborn." So there's nothing more identity stripping, really, than to take your very name, a name which means something. It means rose, and they give her another name, a name which is nonsensical in her language. It means firstborn, and she wasn't even firstborn. So, you know, her identity was very much stripped in that way. Obviously, as an Indian in the U.S. at that time, her individual rights were taken away when she was removed from her community and was living amongst the white people. And then again, even her language was taken away, which might be probably equally important to identity as a name, because by the time later on she got to interact with Lakota people, she found she at first couldn't even converse with them in their own language until bits of it started to come back to her. And through the course of her life, she realizes that not only was this genocide and this stripping of identity something she had to endure, but it was all done completely legally from the white people's perspective, because she ended up going to work for a lawyer named Briscoe. And so her job was to work in the lawyer's office and to help him with the books and that sort of thing. And in talking about the lawyer Briscoe, her employer, Winona, says, "I knew that among his many weighty titles he was commissioner for the railroad, and I was supposed he was some other mighty thing for the militia too. No kindness and no cruelty in white eye America was ever done without a piece of paper somewhere tipped in. Even an Indian girl like me, bobbed up to look like a clean-faced boy, knew that. All my people had been killed clean to the letter of the law, I did not doubt. Not our law, but our law was just words in the wind." And so she's saying the law of her people, the Lakota, was a verbal law. The law of the white people, the lawyers and the courts and all that, was all done on paper. And the very wiping out and genocide of her people was all done in a very legal manner. And in fact, going all the way back to the beginning of the book, again to page 3, Winona is talking about how Indians were even lower in social status than black folks, and she makes this comment: "It wasn't a crime to beat an Indian, not at all." So yes, these are the laws that the US and my country, Canada, were built upon, on stripping the identities of the people that were here before us and the people who really built up these nations through their slave labors. And of course, I talked about Winona's mental health struggles, about her constant feeling of being mentally unsettled, and how all these traumas really affected her ability to have any sort of real mental foundation, as it were. Along similar lines, I guess, Sebastian Barry, as an Irishman, has some similar experiences, I guess, with the history of Ireland as it relates especially to the United Kingdom and that whole area. And in fact, the Irish in the story are constantly looked down on by the other white folks in the American army when they were serving in the army and that sort of thing. So there's all these issues around identity that are really explored, and the removal of identity and the effect that has on individuals and on people as a whole. Now, before I conclude with the ratings here, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some really nice quotes about life and people. And so we'll just dive right into it from A Thousand Moons with a conversation between Winona and another girl that she met. And Winona has sought out this girl to thank her for something, and so the girl says, "You come all this way with that threadbare old dress?" "I come to see you too, and to thank you." "For what?" "For bringing me up to the road." "You took my hand in that bush when I was just set to drown. We square in the matter of debt. My life, your life. You had no need to come out and see me." "I come out to see you because I needed to see you, that all." "I never had no one needing to see me. God damn it, I never did. Maybe you fixin' to kill me. Maybe something in you wants to finish the work you were doing when I stopped you." "Well, that ain't true. Truth is, I just don't know why I came. You never do something and not be knowing why you done it?" "Well, what is the riddle of life? Toing and froing, thising and thating, and not knowing what intarnation we doing it all for." But then we get a little bit more into meaning, and for that I'll go back to Days Without End here. And Thomas is narrating, "So I ride into town. That little bay horse goes on nicely. She got the best walk of any horse I ever owned, just clipping along with a tack, tack, tack on the dry earth. Sweet life. I was sore in love with all my laboring in Tennessee. Liked well that life. Up with the cockcrow, bed with the dark. Going along like that could never end. And when ending, it would be felt to be just. You had your term. All that stint of daily life we sometimes spit on like it was something waste, but it all there is, and in it is enough. I do believe so. John Cole, handsome John Cole, Winona, Old Man Liege, Tennyson and Rosalie, this lithesome bay, home, our riches, all I owned, enough." And what a great summary of what it means to live a simple, but contented life. That part that he describes as all that stint of daily life we sometimes spit on like it was something waste. But yet it is where real contentment can be found in our day-to-day interactions, especially with the people he loves, who he lists here one by one. And then ping-ponging back to 1,000 Moons. Tennyson Bouguereau was sitting on the porch in his accustomed corner. The redbud tree that someone had planted years ago was neither too dense nor scant. Its big flame of flowers burned without moving. I heard Rosalie talking suddenly loudly and laughing suddenly. It's a wonder, all that talk that goes on in lives and never much considered or remembered. Never prompted too much by actual thought, and no matter, just the merciful bird song of whatever bird we are. Again, just the happiness of being near people we love, no matter what is happening. These last two quotes will come from Days Without End. Thomas here is talking about his adopted daughter, Winona. No exaggeration to say she got a laugh like a freshet in a summer meadow. When he first came into the hotel room, Mr. Noon had bowed to her and took her hand and shook it gently and said, "How do?" "I do well," she said in her best Boston English learned off Mrs. Neal. "Just a moment of something that didn't mean nothing. It gave me heart to see. Things that give you heart are rare enough. Better note them in your head when you find them and not forget." This calls back to mind something I read in a book that was a collection of Kurt Vonnegut's speeches and essays and so forth. The book title was "If This Isn't Nice, What Is?" And I made a video about that book. And the title of that book comes from a quote from, I think, one of Kurt Vonnegut's uncles, who had a habit of saying, whenever they were just sharing a nice, quiet moment together, he had a habit of saying, "If this isn't nice, what is?" Just a way of acknowledging how nice life could be and just absorbing that moment, taking it to heart, focusing your mind on the little happinesses that can be found here and there throughout your day. And so very much the same idea as things that give you heart are rare enough. Better note them in your head when you find them and not forget. Very similar idea. And then finally, speaking of heart, we have Thomas talking about his days in the army with his lover, John Cole. And he says, "The Catholic chaplain carried our wages to the postal depot and sent our put-together sum up to Grand Rapids under Army wrap. He never asked no tricky questions about wives. John Cole's daughter was a handle good enough for him." John Cole's daughter being Winona. "But he's one of those sociable, easy-hearted Italian pastors, and all ranks like him, and all religions. A good heart carries across fences. Father Giovanni, small man, wouldn't be much good for fighting, but he good for tightening those screws that start to come loose on the engine of a man when he's facing God knows what. A good heart carries across fences." And here we see all this talk in these books of the stratification of society, of the white folks, the black folks, the Indians. And here he says, a good heart carries across fences. So no matter what you are, no matter who you are, a good heart can allow you to connect with anybody. If there's one thing these books and modern life both illustrate, is that the world is in need of good hearts. Good hearts that hold love and not hatred. Hearts that hold respect and acceptance and not division and factionalization. But let's finish off with the ratings now. So back about 9 years ago or so, when I read Days Without End for the first time, I had said that it was pretty much in the top 5 works of fiction I had ever read up to that point. And I had given it a rating of 9.5 out of 10. And I think the reason I had docked just half a point on the rating there was because I was really annoyed by the fact that when there's conversations in the book, the author doesn't use quotation marks. And prior to reading this book, I believe I had just recently read a couple of books by Marion Taves, who is an author who doesn't use quotation marks for the conversations. And I was just so annoyed, and I was like, these pretentious modern authors trying to all be cool and avant-garde, not using quotation marks, making the work of the reader that much harder when it doesn't have to be the case, blah, blah, blah. So I was kind of annoyed with it at that time. But having reread the book, it wasn't as big a deal to me, in part because, like I said, this book is narrated by Thomas in his older age, and the whole thing is him looking back on his life and describing the events of his life. There's not a lot of actual conversation that is quoted in the book, and when it is, it's more like he's remembering these people talking to each other and the gist of what they were saying to each other. So doesn't, it would have been nice to have the quotation marks from a reader standpoint, but I can see why they were maybe left out in that context. Now, the quotation marks were used, again, in 1,000 Moons, so that was nice. And although this is a similar situation where the narrator is talking about past events, it feels more like a situation where there is an immediacy to the story as opposed to these things are things that happened long ago, and so it feels like the conversations are happening more in real time, as it were, and so the quotation marks are more helpful in that case. So all that being said, I was like, I can't rate this book anything less than a perfect 10 out of 10. For the author to work this alchemy, as that one GoodReads reviewer described, to take all these traumatic, incredibly horrible events and to make such a beautiful story that is so beautifully written. Yes, nothing is 100% perfect. There are, like I said, the contrast between the author's sort of gruff, uneducated language and his eloquent, gorgeous descriptions. I would say that maybe in general, the characters that he interacts with throughout the course of the 12 years or so of the story are perhaps a little unrealistically accepting of his presentation as a woman. And then I would say for the final climax, the resolution might be slightly contrived. So there's little niggly things here and there, but I mean, it really doesn't get any better than this as far as books go, in my opinion. So perfect 10 out of 10 for Days Without End. As for 1,000 Moons, on the other hand, my main problem with the book, despite how beautiful it is in its own way, is that so much of it feels like just a copy-paste from Days Without End. So I mentioned Days Without End, the main character being a trans woman, and then similarly our main character in 1,000 Moons could be potentially described as a trans man or possibly a two-spirit person, like I said. So both characters come to this discovery throughout the course of the story, and both books have a very similar climax at the very end of the book. The big scary thing that the main character has to overcome and the slightly contrived way in which it is overcome. It feels way too much like just a copy paste of one book to another book, and so it doesn't set itself apart enough from Days Without End. Yes, it is a sequel, but it shouldn't be just kind of the same thing happening again with a repeat of the character's identity and the final events that take place and so forth. The other thing was, it's kind of weird. I mean, it shouldn't necessarily be the case, but this was a more uncomfortable and difficult read because of how personal that the story of the teenage rape victim was. So like I said, that was sort of the main question and mystery that hung over the plot of the book as the story went on, was the identity of the rapist of Winona. And there's something about that kind of individual horrific violence that is a little bit more difficult to live in throughout the course of the book than these kind of broader genocides and murders and things that are taking place, even though it could be argued that things that are happening to entire nations of people are maybe more significant than what happens to an individual. And yet all these events that are happening to nations a nation is a group of individuals. So I don't know if I'm making any sense here, but it was a more difficult read for me to get through 1,000 Moons and the specific trauma and violence that we had to endure as a reader of this book than its prequel. So I think if I had only read 1,000 Moons on its own, I would have given it a higher rating. As it is, I sort of landed on, I think, a 7 out of 10 for 1,000 Moons. I'm not sure how high a rating I would have given it if I had read it on its own, if I would have gone up to 8.5, 9 out of 10. And I don't know if that's really fair to, although maybe it is because it is a sequel, and so you would hope that the author would maybe take it in some different directions instead of more of the same type of thing. Regardless, they're both incredibly well written. It was such a pleasure to be able to talk about books without having to complain about the writing and the technical aspects of poorly written stories. More than anything, I would highly recommend checking out Days Without End by Sebastian Barry. This is truly a masterpiece, truly one of my #1 works of fiction of all time. And it's not even that long a book. It's only like just over 250 pages, so certainly check it out if it sounds like the type of thing you would enjoy. If there's anything else that you would recommend I check out, please do let me know. I'm curious to hear what you're reading. If what you're reading is hitting for you or if it's not, please do get into the comments. I'd love to hear all about it. And regardless, I just really appreciate you watching. Cheers. What's really astonishing to me, at what point in the video was I talking about that? The time that the events in the time and really well done in A Days Without End. A mortgaged just clipping along with the tick-tack. Just clipping along. And I was, you know,